I've been thinking a lot about how I want to approach the mission that I've set out for myself of conducting psychological journalism. And I think I've found a starting place. We're going to begin with the investigation of psychologies of individual political celebrities. I'm not totally thrilled about this, as I realize this is a pretty direct route into the realm of ad hominem. But in recognition of that, I've set myself a couple of guidelines here. Firstly, I'm going to maintain throughout that these really are just personal observations and interpretations. You might say it's my B-tier psychoanalysis. It's based on my own personal appraisal. You might have a different interpretation of the person in discussion. Secondly, none of these videos is going to feature either unilateral praise or criticism, because I think balance is key when discussing people. We need to place their actions in the context of what they were thinking, what they were considering, and what would the cost be of failing to take the action that they ended up taking. I understand this prioritization of balance comes at the cost of creating ethical equivalence among all people. But contrarily, the extreme alternative is to create dichotomous categorizations, good and evil, or even more elaborate hierarchies in which we rank people based on their supposed virtue. And I think these alternatives are equally, if not more, ridiculous. We need to judge people. That's important. But the judgment has to come with constructive intention, not with spiteful or hierarchical intention. Lastly, I want these to be somewhat instructive. So the aim is for the subject of each of my videos, were they to watch, that they would glean something useful about themselves and how other people view them. Because we often have better instincts with regards to judging others while lacking that same intuition of our own character, which I think is characterized pretty well via a quotation from the psychologist Alfred Adler, which I'll paraphrase. One of the great tragedies of life is that we go through much of it without knowing what others truly think of us. Admittedly, this places me in a potential position of arrogance, where it's my own appraisals of others that are being considered, my own interpretations that are so well suited to approximate objective analysis. This is a perfectly legitimate concern, and one that I'm going to have to put up with throughout. But in my view, it's well worth the sacrifice, because if nothing else, this video and the subsequent ones that I do are going to serve as a gateway to introspection, a rare opportunity for someone to hear a well-referenced perspective of how others truly view them. And so without further ado, today we're going to be discussing David Pakman, the host of the David Pakman Show, nationally syndicated radio and television program, available on YouTube. I'll go through all of the typical accolades here. And a man who served as one of my primary introductions into progressive politics. Concerns with our country's fledgling healthcare system, its use of privately owned prisons, its excessive stigmatization of drugs that, when used in responsible settings, nourish the human soul. These were only some of the many issues where I think progressive voices like David's were out in front. I valued David's contributions to the political space for quite some time. Foremost, for his willingness to initiate dialogue with controversial guests, without excessive interruption.
Don't bully me.
Okay, let me ask you.
Don't intimidate me. I'm not afraid of you.
I've got to be able to ask questions. It's a debate.
But maintaining a confrontational attitude that holds guests' feet to the fire. So, for example, in 2017, he interviewed Richard Spencer, one of the leading figures of the alt-right movement, who I remember seeing for the first time in a video where he was addressing followers.
Hail Trump! Hail our people! Hail victory!
So let's just see if we can figure out sort of how you describe your political philosophy Do you consider yourself to be any of the following: white nationalist, white separatist, neo-Nazi, Nazi, white supremacist? Do any of those terms apply to how you see yourself?
I think white nationalist would be the term that I'm most comfortable with. The term that I identify with is identitarian. And to sum that up most concisely, that means that identity is the foundation of thinking about politics, thinking about culture, thinking about society.
Now, today's video is not about Spencer, though there would be plenty of interesting discussion if it were. We're looking at how David handles these interviews with guests like Spencer, someone with views he would surely consider abhorrent. On the point, David has always featured this twinge of sarcasm in his act, a quality that likely carries different reception depending on your political disposition. Some viewers, more often those with ideologically divergent views, view these displays as unnecessarily disrespectful and ego-driven. Others, however, enjoy the drama manufactured through this demeanor.
The second Klan was not engaged in violence, by the way. It was a kind of Americanist group.
Okay, so you don't denounce them. That's okay. I mean, I'm just asking.
I'm not going to denounce these historical things.
Spencer's interview, for instance, is just one example of David's trademark tactics at play. Titling the video "White Nationalist," "Alt-Right," "Richard Spencer," "Sucker Punched," "Won't Denounce Hitler," "Talks Jews," brilliantly paints his interlocutor as weak enough to be sucker punched, crazy enough to not denounce Hitler, and then stupid enough to then talk about Jews after establishing himself as wanting a European ethno-state long term.
It would involve the establishment of a homeland for European people. What that would entail, I don't know, because this is something in the future.
I think in this instance, David is burdening himself with an ethical responsibility of portraying Spencer in a sufficiently absurd light. Because surely from his perspective, some of the things Richard Spencer appears to stand for are abhorrent enough to warrant manipulative treatment. He's the bad guy, right? Given he is this evil racist, he would certainly do the same thing to you if you let your guard down, right? David is ethnically Jewish. That probably plays a little bit of a role in this whole dynamic as well.
Their consciousness is, in a way, anti-assimilation to Gentiles. We recently celebrated Hanukkah this past December. And
Were
January,
you part of that?
Oh, well, no.
You mean the Jews recently celebrated Hanukkah, yeah.
And if you share most of David's political convictions, this is a completely rational justification, which is why his core audience appreciates these tactics and reveres David's ability to outwit the villains of this era. Now, depending on whether you like Richard Spencer and what he stands for, or stood for at that time, you're obviously going to have a different outlook on this interview. Like, if you believe Spencer is a totally corrupt actor who presents a veneer of respectability in order to hide nefariously racist motives.
I win, they lose. That's how the world works. Little they get ruled by people like me. Little octoroons. My ancestors enslaved those pieces of We're gonna win. I rule the world.
Then you're more likely to think, as I believe David does, that more manipulative means are justified to produce an end where Spencer is not seen in a publicly legitimate light. At this point, case in point, Richard Spencer is not a mainstream figure. And on the contrary, if you believe that Spencer presents legitimate concerns regarding white European interests that have been left behind, that shouldn't be totally dismissed, like the right of a people to develop a demographically homogeneous ethno-state, if you believe those concerns are legitimate, you're more likely to dislike the tactics to which David resorts. And you certainly, this is perhaps even more important, you certainly won't appreciate the fact that David conducts this interview with an intention, at least an apparent intention, of exposing the racism in a person rather than revealing anything important he might have to contribute. People aren't all good or bad. You can have bad actors, but if you actually listen to what they're saying, you might be able to glean some useful insight into what other people are going through and thinking about. And this is sort of the balance of political navigation. Interviewing people who have views that are considered and perhaps even should be considered outside the domain of public respectability. You still need to listen. And I think this is something we're getting particularly bad at in this society today. Regardless, throughout this interview, David repeatedly demonstrates an ability to ask confronting questions to this controversial guest in a respectful enough manner.
The aspect that I've noticed is that the alt-right generally is very critical of what we've come to know as so-called identity politics in the US, to the extent that it focuses on non-white identity, non-heterosexual sexual orientation, etc. It's very critical of so-called identity politics, yet at the same time, it's completely about white identity. Is that not a contradiction of sorts?
No, I think the alt-right is certainly willing to go there. It's willing to criticize the left in a tougher manner than most conservatives. We're certainly willing to point out the outrages of Black Lives Matter and so on. However, I think I would agree that you are getting to, it's not really a contradiction. It's maybe just something that's a bit surprising. I think the typical conservative response to, say, Black Lives Matter or say, Islamic immigration into Europe primarily and so on, is to say, well, why don't you dispense with all this identity politics? White people have dispensed with identity politics, so should you. Let's all become citizens and individuals and so on. We don't see race and the like. The alt-right is actually fundamentally different than that.
It never turns into the ridiculous screaming match that I highlighted that often appears on shows like Piers Morgan Uncensored. But when you don't turn the conversation into a screaming match, it allows it to achieve a bit more depth. When people listen, who would have thought? When ideas are exchanged, who would have thought? The conversation actually goes somewhere. It isn't merely constrained to banal talking points that you hear parroted by left and right. I think this interview epitomizes David's strategical approach when it comes to dealing with certain guests. He extracts more from the conversation than many mainstream left-wing journalists because he's willing to let his guests speak. Sometimes in hopes they hang themselves. He seems to take a lot of pride in this role too, as in it's a unique contribution offered to the left-wing media space. Being able to uphold free speech by interviewing the most dangerous voices, from his perspective of course, in a manner that reveals their own bad faith. He lets them speak, he pushes back a little, he doesn't scream over them, it's a little bit sarcastic, but he's able to facilitate these memeable moments.
Adolf, National Socialism was a disaster. The 20th century was pretty much a disaster.
But do you denounce the actions of Adolf Hitler?
I'm not gonna play this game.
Oh, it's not a game.
You throw out historical figures and I denounce them. I mean, do you denounce Stalin? Do you denounce Pol Pot? I mean, look.
Yeah.
Of course, I think there's a danger in this approach as well, where David has more recently fallen victim. We'll get to that later. But next I want to dive into a different brand of interview that more robustly depicts how David handles folks he would insist come from the absurd variety. I'm talking, of course, about his infamous discussions with Jesse Lee Peterson, the pastor and conservative radio personality who hosts the Jesse Lee Peterson radio show and The Fallen State. Now, once again, this video is not about Jesse, so I'll try to keep my commentary on him limited to an assessment of David's personal appraisals, as much as someone like Jesse tempts me. The first thing we have to acknowledge is how David himself regards these interviews.
Amazing!
David views Jesse and the positions he puts forth as inherently unserious.
A nurse?
Yeah.
Beta! The children of the lie.
And I think people who follow me understand that the attitude I took was this entire thing is really not super serious.
thus warranting unserious treatment. Well, actually, there was one interview where he tried to more assertively challenge Jesse on some points, but that ended up getting him kicked off the show.
Bizarre questions.
You're
and not
acting like
answering
an
any of them.
idiot and you're wasting my time. I appreciate
ad
you
hominem.
coming. All right, thank
It's
you
an
for
ad
coming.
hominem, so you know
Goodbye.
that.
Goodbye.
So understandably, that was a strategy he abandoned for subsequent appearances. More succinctly, these interviews tended to be elegant illustrations of David's attempt to create political satire with an unwitting participant. And as far as entertainment is concerned, it does make for some hilarious content.
But it's abnormal for a man to be a liberal or progressive. It's a sign of being a beta male.
I didn't know that.
Because real men are conservative, Republican, you know, and strong in
Wow.
nature. So I'm concerned if you're a liberal or progressive.
If I became conservative, would I no longer be beta?
You become alpha.
Wow. Something to think about.
Yeah.
Here are a few more instances where he appears to dial up the sarcasm.
It's a year now since he's been elected, and the great white hope is making America great again. David, welcome back to the show.
Oh, I can't even tell you what a pleasure it is to be back with you today. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome, man.
This is what we call burden of proof, Jesse. And I would assume that you know this as someone who's been in this world for a long time.
Reminder, this is not a video about Jesse Lee Peterson or his politics. But I do need to point out a specific tactic that Jesse uses inside these conversations that provides rationale for David's dismissive approach throughout. Jesse will frequently ask David, and he does this to all guests as well, he'll ask them yes or no questions. Unfortunately, yes or no questions that are just answered yes or no often omit important contextual gray areas. Take this example.
Well, you know right from wrong when you see it, right?
Do I know right from wrong? I don't know. Do I?
You don't know if you know right from wrong?
I think people want to know what's right and what's wrong, but if everybody knew right from wrong, no bad things would ever happen, right?
But how about you? Do you know right from wrong?
I feel like I do.
Answering this question directly, yes or no, without providing any explanation, is completely vacuous. Like, if you answer yes without elaboration, you're going to fail to justify where the certainty of your moral convictions is derived. What are the philosophical foundations of your morality? Are they religious? How do you know that your religion is the absolute truth? Why are practitioners of other religions with similar levels of conviction flawed in their alternative interpretations of right and wrong? These are all questions you need to consider. If you answer no, completely different set of questions. You might appear foolish, like you don't have a well-defined blueprint for how to act in the world. And so your answer necessitates an explanation. Are you a moral relativist? Do you believe in some kind of Sam Harris-esque moral landscape? Perhaps you're an ethical emotivist? Perhaps you simply reject the framing of the question because it's too vague? Every culture throughout history, to some extent, has answered that question in a slightly different iteration. Jesse, as you might expect, either doesn't understand or doesn't care about the complexity of these questions. So he solely aims to obtain yes or no answers with repeated requests. On the other hand, due to the interest of upholding the satirical theater of these interviews, the theater, David's dismissiveness toward every one of Jesse's statements prevents him from even partially integrating any of the right's wisdom. Let me give you an example. At one point, Jesse makes a statement about how the Democratic Party hates masculinity in men.
Masculinity, they hate men, real men, straight men.
What's an example of that? Can you give me some evidence of that, Jesse?
They hate, they're attacking Christianity and white straight male.
David then asks him to provide evidence for that statement, and Jesse, for his lack of linguistic prowess, is unable to provide any substantive material to back this claim. Now let me be clear. David's request for evidence is, of course, completely reasonable in this instance. However, I think it simultaneously frustrates a lot of conservatives who would simply take a statement like Jesse's at face value. If we're going to have a conversation about how values of individual responsibility and lower taxation, for instance, characterize a more masculinely oriented right-wing temperament, while values of charity and collective compassion, let's say, more align with more feminine values and a femininely oriented left-wing temperament, we can have that discussion. Or more aptly, you and I, or you and a more verbally capable conservative, can have that conversation. But in this case, it seems you would rather dismiss the claim entirely based on the basis that your conversational companion is not equipped to articulate the rationale for his feelings. I know it's gratifying to know your own talking points are sufficiently substantiated while his are inchoate ejaculations. But if your motivation to understand where someone is coming from hinges on their own intellect, you're going to shut a lot of wisdom out of your life. Given what we've discussed, I would have to concede that handling an interview with Jesse Lee Peterson is challenging, especially with the expectation that he is intellectually unable to carry out the interview he purports to be conducting. As the old adage goes, never argue with an idiot. They're going to drag you down to their level and beat you with experience. Navigating this kind of exchange has its own dangers for that reason. However, there are moments in these interactions where David's sarcasm and dismissiveness imply a kind of condescension toward all who would share views with someone like Jesse.
Beliefs that I had sort of assembled over time, and then I was questioning all of my beliefs. So I definitely have had it sort of a shift to the left. I was never a right-winger. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But I've definitely moved to the left the more I've become educated about issues.
The more I've become educated, the more I've moved to the left, lands with a bite, implying all you right-wing people simply aren't as educated as I am. You're not as intelligent and articulate. He uses the attention and admiration from these interviews as fuel and confirmation that he is more intelligent than those stupid right-wingers. It's a similar kind of criticism as one I've heard waged against Ben Shapiro for the crime of generating intellectual fuel through outwitting college students while not engaging in the same kind of discourse with more intellectually capable participants. We all remember the Ben Shapiro destroys this person and that person and all of the destroys videos. Though I think Ben's actually responded pretty well to this criticism over time. Recently, in fact, debating well-spoken and vociferous debaters on the left like Alex O'Connor and Destiny. Both conversations I thought were thorough and respectful while featuring great points from both sides. And again, this isn't a conversation about specific political issues. If you want to watch those debates, by all means, go ahead. Likewise, when I reacted to David's interview with Vivek Ramaswamy, I was interested to see David's performance within a conversation where he is rhetorically rivaled, if not outmatched.
The Burisma payments to Hunter Biden are a deep problem. $5 million paid by a Ukrainian company, privately owned by somebody who at the time was sitting on the National Security Council in Ukraine.
And no doubt, there were moments I thought he pushed Vivek.
I think we're on track to achieve the goal. The goal is to be the Republican nominee and then to become the president, and then more importantly, to revive our national identity and lead our nation forward. And I think that I'm on track to do it. And I know that that would not necessarily be exactly what you see for the static polling today.
It's not obvious, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yes, Vivek is somewhat in politician mode. He has to continue to provide the illusion that he's going to be in this race and that he believes he can win the race, because how attractive is a candidate who doesn't believe they can win the race? There were also moments where I thought Vivek pushed him, specifically on the issue of defining wokeness.
There's also a deeper cancer. I mean, wokeness is a worldview that says that there are certain invisible social relationships between us, grounded on oppression or oppressor relationships and statuses of people based on race, gender, and sexuality. That you're either oppressor or oppressed based on those genetic attributes, that there are invisible societal injustices resulting from them, and that we have to be awake, alert to those injustices and then correct for them.
I have a different one, which is much simpler, which is simply becoming woke is becoming aware that there are problems in our society bigger than any one person's circumstances. That's how I define it. And I know it's very different from what you're saying.
That's a slightly different definition, and one that is set up for more people to agree with it. But I think that, but I think that that's not, respectfully, David, that's a definition that on its own does not support the specificity of policies that follow from it.
Vivek even called him out for his own arrogance to his face.
But I know you in some sense of the word, okay? Like, you're not unfamiliar to me. And what I see amongst even my peers, right, is a form of laziness. I think I'm saying this out of respect and not an attack, in a constructive way. I saw a little bit of it in the start of this conversation, right? Where you're going to be able to smoke out a version of that which can be caricatured, but these are our fellow citizens. And their concerns come from a deep place.
Okay.
Where if you can do a better job of articulating and smoking out where that concern comes from, then we have an obligation to do it.
But what stood out to me particularly was how David handled the aftermath of this interview. He at least acknowledged that he was underprepared at times.
And I am the first to tell you, I don't think I did a great job of controlling that interview.
But he also kept using terms like,
now, I am going to be the first to tell you, this guy is an excellent filibusterer.
But maybe how about you acknowledge some of the reasonable points that your debate opponent made? But guess what? That requires humility. And that's David's kryptonite. But I think there's also something deeper going on that's impacting the entire political discussion space, which is as a result of conducting so many interviews over time, where the expectation of guests is one of bad faith and ideological motivation, David isn't able to calibrate his behavior to individuals with alternative motives. A prime example of this occurred in the aftermath of his interview with Trigonometry. The original video from Trigonometry was David Pakman, a good faith debate with a progressive, that featured fairly productive seeming conversation. Here's some highlights from that interview.
And social democracy is a well-regulated form of capitalism where we say there's lots of good things about capitalism and about markets directing resources in many areas, but there are some what we would call special cases, and these might, depending on who you ask, include healthcare, they might include education and other what we call public goods. And in order to fund those public goods, we would use taxes. You're still allowed to make a ton of money, you can still become very wealthy, but we would use some of the top wealth to say, let's fund these special areas that we would say are exceptions to free market capitalism. The American right wing has given up on policy. They don't really talk about taxes anymore. They don't really talk about immigration reform. They take a cultural approach. Gentlemen, Donald Trump was a humiliating embarrassment. I mean, just the promises he made, none of them were kept. You know, he was going to build a wall. He didn't build it. He was going to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Jared actually was going to solve it, his son-in-law. As you know, it hasn't been solved.
David then re-uploaded a 19-minute and 25-second version of the interview on his own channel with the title, Progressive Double-Teamed by Right-Wingers, all caps, Disaster. The top comment on his own release said, it wasn't really a disaster. There was non-aggressive political conversation happening. Already an indication that there was conflict between how David had attempted to frame the headline of the interview compared to its public perception. I suppose David might respond by pointing to the idea that titles are meant to be dramatic and gripping. Here's actually a clip of him elaborating a bit more on that point in a video he titled, Eric Weinstein Attacks, Sam Harris Defends.
Now, I want to be really clear, especially because Eric and Sam might see this YouTube clip. The YouTube clip title is sort of a joke. My YouTube titles are often sort of jokes. We play around satirically with the ways that it's become sort of en vogue to title YouTube clips. This person was destroyed, that person was attacked, whatever. It's just a joke. So please, the YouTube titles are meant to be interesting, but the important thing is the discussion.
The difference in this case is his unwanted distortion of a political label itself, right-wing, being misattributed to Constantine and Francis. It's one thing to go on the Michael Knowles show and call him right-wing, because he would also acknowledge he's on the right. But that's not how it is with trigonometry, as understood by both hosts and their entire audience. In this case, David plays up the drama for his left-wing crowd through a term like right-wing instead of adhering to a more accurate but less interesting term like centrist. Centrist, man, that is the least attractive word ever. In all fairness, though, I think these labels are mostly stupid, which is why I continue to call myself a liberal, as meaningless as its original definition now stands in the face of its corruption. In addition to this release, David added a live stream the next day titled, "I Was on Right-Wing Trigonometry." This stream featured a few moments where David appeared to select certain regions of the interview where he presumably thought he outdueled his interviewers, laughing after Constantine acknowledged that he didn't know enough about the subject to discuss it further.
Let's pick it up. Oh, I don't know. We did we did Biden administration. Okay, yeah, let's pick it up where we were and listen.
Operations could have gone better. Do you think that's...
Okay, hold on.
When Trump was given, that was a quagmire. No, listen, I mean,
I think we were here.
Identify anything that changed materially. Is that fair?
What I would say is I think some progress was made in a very difficult situation. I don't claim that the situation became dramatically different and we are now like way towards a solution. And also, I think I'd also concede that it's not an issue I know enough about to have a proper discussion with you as well.
That's fair. We can table it on that basis. No, listen, I mean, as far as Joe Biden's not.
There were some other moments where David had a similar reaction, and to many watching, this was the pinnacle of arrogance. To be fair to David, though, laughter is not exactly a controlled response, and I think many of us, if we're being honest with ourselves, have felt that thrill of superiority in moments. But it does all come back to David's revealed evaluation of the people he's talking to, that to him, this conversation was never meant to establish future allyship. It was never intended to lead anywhere further than an opportunity to pose one's intellectual brilliance. Now, I obviously don't truly know what is in David's mind, but the display on its own aligns his motives in that moment as being more concerned with appearing smarter than his opponents than with moving conversations forward on important subjects. As one might expect, underneath this upload, the comments are brutal. Quote, "Whether David Pakman realizes it or not, he has done damage to his brand by stooping this low and giving in to indulging his ego. Backstabbing the hosts of trigonometry in this fashion is a below-the-line move, particularly calling them right-wing and seemingly thinking that this justifies his lack of integrity. One doesn't have to agree with everything the trigonometry hosts say, or with all of the guests they have on their show, to appreciate their efforts at broadening the discussions on issues that have polarized us, and to be reality grounded while you're at it. Unlike Pakman, both Kisin and Foster have shown themselves to consistently value integrity and honesty. What was Pakman thinking when he decided that doing this would be a good move for him and his progressive causes?" That last sentence holds weight. What can progressives ever accomplish other than to embody the very best of the issues for which they purport to advocate? Quote, "David, you have let yourself down. This is a complete misrepresentation of the full interview and needlessly hostile to people who tried to have an open conversation with you. I didn't think you would be so dishonest. Anyone watching the actual interview will see how unfair you have been. I am sorry to see you stoop so low." Constantine and Francis then uploaded a retaliation. David Pakman destroys trigonometry with bad faith and smears, pointing out many of these seemingly disingenuous occasions. One of the key points from this upload that I want to highlight is a moment where the three of them are discussing the issue of trans women in female prisons, and David mentions that a petite, feminine-appearing trans woman is more statistically likely to be assaulted in a male prison than she is to assault others in a female prison.
If you have a trans woman that is biologically male and has a penis, but is slight in size and has a very feminine appearance, by all statistical likelihood, they are far less likely to assault someone in a women's prison than they are to be assaulted in a men's prison. And
you can agree with that statement or not. The point is, after that took place, Constantine and Francis decide to move on, leading David in his live stream to start laughing again.
Okay. We could go around for hours, but look.
All of a sudden, we've spent too much time
with the appearance that they were just conceding the issue in the debate. Again, this is an important moment because it highlights how David interpreted this exchange as a battleground, as Constantine highlights right here.
He sees the conversation as a battle, and so when I suggest we move on to avoid wasting everyone's time, he thinks he's won.
The battleground philosophy of conversation is somewhat understandable for someone who has been in the center of political discussion for as long as David. In his interview with Spencer, he was naturally primed to view the interview as this battleground between his noble intentions and Spencer's malicious ones, given his own appraisal of Spencer's motives. This philosophy is furthered by a Machiavellian spirit that places all interactions in the context of power and domination. It's important to note that those who possess this mentality are not inherently misguided. However, to wield such weapons leads one to become possessed by them, to be unable to determine who is playing the same game and who does in fact want to converse or even debate in good faith. Thus, David's experience with certain right-wing figures has clearly led him to a view of the right as a whole as being manipulative and disingenuous. And I'm not going to lie to you, the way I view it, in many cases, he may be correct, which all the more justifies this approach. But I don't think this disingenuous behavior is political. I don't think it has anything to do with being left or right. This is psychological. It's whether you're willing to look at your political opposition, at least the noblest among them, as people who can be persuaded, with enough patience, with enough openness, and with enough mutual respect. This analysis was about understanding how David Pakman's psychology might have been influenced by his placement in the YouTube space for such an extended time. Interviews with the likes of Richard Spencer and Jesse Lee Peterson have perhaps led David to a position where he is overly concerned about how he appears within these interview contexts. In the case of Jesse, it's simple. Taking someone seriously who doesn't deserve it gives them undue credence. In the case of Spencer, it's a bit more complicated. But to be too kind, too non-confrontational in front of a left-wing audience alienates your supporters. You'll be condemned for letting the racist off the hook, even if you are just trying to conduct a civil interview. Furthermore, Pakman understands that someone like Spencer is not an idiot and thus can't be underestimated in that format. It places a lot of pressure on someone, pressure to perform as to not be embarrassed. It's thus understandable that he would see his ethical responsibility as in line with humiliating certain opposition. And yet at the same time, what happens when that spirit extends into confrontations where duplicitous acts aren't necessary? If you're only ever prepared for nails, you'll always bring a hammer. Overall, there exists a terror of looking stupid, justifying a preference for taking precautions, even ethically dubious ones, instead of showing earnest vulnerability with the risk of humiliation. Before concluding this discussion, I want to turn this back not just on David and his own essential qualities, but on ourselves as viewers or former viewers or inquisitive onlookers. Because many of the criticisms I've offered of David today are things I've either been accused of in the past or are still personal struggles of mine. Mainly ego and the ways I express it, both consciously and unconsciously so. One of the most common inevitabilities of psychological analysis is projection, and this was no exception. Psychological projection is often viewed with negative regard, especially when it's perpetrated without self-awareness. But isn't there something hauntingly genuine in our propensity to see ourselves in others? As if it's through judgment that we look into the doorway of connection. To analyze others through a critical eye responsibly beckons us inward to evaluate where we might resort to similar antics in less ideal moments. The feelings of righteous superiority that echo from our magnanimous musings. I'm the critical thinker. I'm the one who does things in good faith. I'm both advocating and living a path where more benefit, whereas those who resist are too deranged or revolting to see otherwise. and those who suffer upon my intended enactments are too stupid to deserve anything better. Or maybe we are everything we blame others for being. If my words hold any power whatsoever, perhaps they can one day bear accountability for any transformation that occurs. Admittedly, these kinds of discussions never take place in person due to the inherent awkwardness and impracticality of offering tons of intense praise and criticism at once. Part of being a public figure, on the other hand, is to be confronted with endless amounts of feedback, much of which comes from angry, sarcastic, and anonymous sources. Distinguishing between criticism that is genuine and constructive versus feedback that is unreliable and undignified is a task. It's perhaps more sensible to ignore most criticism with the assumption that most who provide such do so in bad faith. I hope I can prove myself over time as someone who isn't looking to tear people down for the sake of ruining their reputations, but as someone who wants to show how these certain traits in question may actually hold people back from getting what they truly want. In the case of David, to be seen as an intellect worthy of admiration, and an advocate in part responsible for whatever changing tides this country can muster away from the most ruthless elements of this dreary corporate oligarchy. Finally, I want to conclude each of these analysis videos by asking this audience to consider how someone wants the world to look. In this case, how do you think David Pakman views a future world carried forth by progressive ideals? I invite you to let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to addressing a different character next time. Take care.